if you want to go ahead, we're going to be in John chapter 4. I want to encourage you to follow along, if you can, on your phone or whatever, because there's going to be kind of a main theme throughout this passage, but there's little things along the way that'll be kind of off to the side. So whatever stands out to you, I just encourage you to make a note, write something down so you can think about it later. One thing I've been thinking about a little bit is, we live in the world of internet, but internet, as far as like human history goes, is still a relatively new phenomenon. Being able to get so much information so quickly. Am I cutting out, y'all, when I am I not allowed to walk? Okay, well, I'm probably going to walk. I don't know how to preach without walking. Anyways, yeah. We have all this information available at our fingertips, and that's never been true before in all of history, not this fast, For the last 30 years or so, internet has become more rapidly available. And that's cool in one sense, because a lot of things that can come from having information fast, but there's also, as people have begun to make a living from information, they've learned, as we all know, that outrage and the shock factor gets more attention than good news, right? And so I kind of think of the internet as like the outrage machine sometimes, sometimes I even say to myself, am I going to get on social media and get my daily dose of outrage today? Because you get on there and there's just so many things to be upset about and up in arms about. And that's what's getting all the attention every day, And it can be hard to see through it clearly because people are creating news pieces intended to provoke and antagonize our emotions. And because of that, one of the things we're as a race learning how to navigate is in this online world, how do we aid the division that wants to creep up on us? And what's so cool is when I came into this chapter today, this week studying it, I didn't really know where I was going with it. A lot of times I'll come into a passage and just be like, okay, God, what do you want to share? And I really feel like today you get a good lesson in how to love people above and through the divides that threaten to engulf our perceptions. So, and that was really cool for me to see. So let's dig into it. A lot of good stuff in here. We're going to start in John 4, verse 1. We're going to read through the first 6 verses. It says, "Now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph, and Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well, and it was about the 6th hour." Now, one thing I want you to notice in verse 6 here that I think is cool is this little statement right here. I think what's cool about it is that's a phrase you could pass over without even thinking about it, Jesus was wearied from his journey, right? But one thing that's interesting about the Bible, this is one of those side notes I was talking about, is that maybe some of you don't think about, is that there were some things that God, maybe never experienced until he became a man. So, for example, in Hebrews 5:8, it says that Jesus learned obedience through the things that he suffered. And it's why would it say that Jesus learned something? He's God, right? And God, of course, knows about obedience, but God, in practice, he's never had to obey anyone. God doesn't obey. And so when Jesus became a man, in a sense, God was learning in practicality what it meant to obey as a human, the Father. Interesting, isn't that? And there's a lot of things like that in the Gospels about Jesus as a man. So it records Jesus as being hungry, thirsty, weary, like we just read, in anguish. He wept, he cried aloud, he felt the agony of death. And I just wanted to point out, little verses like this just help emphasize the truth that Jesus knows our humanity. He knows what it's like to feel what we feel. People always say, like, a good leader doesn't just tell people what to do. He gets in there. He's with them. He experiences it himself. And God is no exception. He chose, like it says in Philippians 2, to humble himself, in a sense, reduce his glory inside of a human body to be able to feel what we feel, to where the one who says he never grows weary, never grows faint, he could feel weariness. And so Hebrews 4 reminds us that he's a compassionate and merciful high priest. Whatever you're feeling, whatever temptation you're dealing with, Jesus has experienced it too, is what it says. And he has compassion towards us. We can approach him with boldness for help because he's been a partaker of our humanity. And I also wanted to point that out because Jesus has been a partaker of our humanity. He sees that we're all the same in our value and our needs. Let's go to the next verse, 4:7. So remember, Jesus is sitting by the well. It says, a woman from Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, give me a drink. Now, what's crazy about this verse, too, is like, this is another verse where if you heard the story a lot of times, you can just pass over this verse like it's not a big deal, you know? But in this one little, like, sentence, Jesus is blowing apart the cultural constructs of his day, okay? So I did some little study, and it was really interesting. We all know the Jews and Samaritans didn't like each other, right? But I don't know if you ever knew why, so I thought I would just put some of the stuff I learned. So Jews viewed Samaritans as ethnically impure, okay? So they regarded them as a mixed population, because, you know, the Jews only married each other. They weren't allowed to marry foreigners and such. But the Samaritans, they believed that they had intermingled with foreign settlers brought in by the Assyrians, okay? So they kind of looked at them as half-breeds. It was racism, basically. The Jews are like, you guys are not as pure as our race, you know? And so that was one thing. And because of that, they couldn't marry each other, stuff like that. And then they also, this is really interesting, which I never knew, they disagreed strongly over where they were supposed to worship. And if you know this story, that comes up. But the Samaritans believed that the true place of worship was not at the temple in Jerusalem, but it was on a mount called Mount Gerizim, okay? And they claimed that was where Abraham had offered Isaac and where Joshua had built the first altar after entering the Promised Land. So there was a big disagreement about where you're supposed to worship. The Samaritans said, over here on this mountain. The Jews said, no, only in Jerusalem. The Samaritans didn't agree with all the books of the Old Testament, so they only took the first 5 books as scripture, and obviously the Jews believed in the prophets and in like the books like 1 Kings, 1 and 2 Samuel, those. They couldn't marry each other. And check this out. I did not know this either. So there's a temple on Mount Gerizim where the Samaritans would worship, and there's a temple in Jerusalem. About 140 years before Jesus came, this Jewish general came and destroyed that temple of the Samaritans. And so the Samaritans still worship there, but they didn't have a temple there anymore. And sometime later, I don't know this before or after Jesus, Samaritans took dead people bones or animal bones, and they went and they scattered them in the temple in Jerusalem. And they desecrated the temple in Jerusalem. So there's a lot of animosity going on here, okay? And I hope this is interesting to you because it's interesting to me. They had different ideas about the Messiah, which I didn't know that either. So the Jews are obviously looking for the Messiah, Christ, the anointed one. The Samaritans are looking for somebody called the Taheb, or the Tahib, however you say that. And whereas the Jews thought that the Messiah was going to restore them spiritually and politically, get rid of the Romans, make them a leading force, the Samaritans thought that the Taheb was going to be a spiritual leader who was going to restore true worship to Mount Gerizim. Okay? So these are the differences, not difference in religion, difference in ethnic purity, supposedly, and different views on the Messiah. So a lot of differences going on here, and they had a lot of reasons not to like each other, okay? And when you look up, like, because I asked, I was using ChatGPT, Scott's getting me into it. I asked ChatGPT, give me some verified talk about the Jews of Samaritans. And they have these blanket statements like the Samaritans can't be trusted in court and you can't marry the Samaritans, They had kind of this general idea of Samaritans that they're lesser than, they're bad. It's that us versus them mentality, right? And that to me was very striking because we live in a day, like I just talked about earlier with the internet, where that us versus them mentality is trying to creep into our lives all the time, right? And that is absolutely essential to the us versus them mentality is dehumanization of the other side. You don't see them as individuals or as people. You put them into a group, you assign labels to the group, and everybody in that group is immediately less and dehumanized. And I just want to say, as one of the main points of the sermon and something to think about, we need to be extremely careful, especially in our day, to avoid ever characterizing people groups with blanket categorizations as a whole. Amen. Let me give you an example, okay? Like immigration is a hot topic right now. And before you get worried, I'm not about to give you my political idea of how we should handle immigration. I'm not qualified with that. But what I find and what I have seen is that there is a challenge to balance supporting policies that we feel protect our nation and also upholding the dignity and showing compassion towards every individual who has the label of an immigrant, right? It's easy to begin to apply blanket categorizations towards the immigrants. You know what I mean? And I think that's something we can all relate to because that's a hot topic in our world right now. The reason this is important, and I'm not saying we're anywhere near this, but the reason thinking about these things is important is just recently on January 27th, the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz concentration camp that happened in 1945. That was the 80th anniversary of that liberation. And we all look back at the Holocaust with horror, right? And we should. And same with slavery. One group of humanity came together to oppress another group of humanity. But the thing that scares me about things like slavery and the Holocaust is how many people back then went along with it, either because they thought it was right or because they were afraid to stand up against the status quo. And the thing that scares me is wondering, would I have gone along? Would I have gotten sucked into that us versus them mentality like so many other people did? Because I don't think I'm better than all those people that got sucked into it, And I think that's why we have to be careful that we don't allow this mindset to infiltrate our mind. Because when you do, when it becomes us versus them, when you begin to dehumanize the other side, you can begin to justify things towards that other side that you never would do for an individual, but you would do for this group that has become dehumanized in your mind, right? We shouldn't be so sure that we would have taken the moral high ground. And I think this passage gives us a great example because despite all the differences between the Jews and the Samaritans, which will come to the surface in this discussion pretty quickly, Jesus was able to see beyond that. In this one simple statement here, he saw an individual standing in front of him. He was able to see through all the dehumanization and propaganda about the Samaritans that he'd grown up with in his Jewish culture. He's able to see through all that and see this person standing in front of him. And the second thing that's amazing about this is that he asked her for something, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but he didn't come in there and be like, hey, I see you as an individual. Can I convince you why the Jews are right and the Samaritans are wrong? He asked her to give him something indicating that he sees her as an individual who has something of value to offer him, right? Let me put it this way. Like in my life, I've had the privilege of working with a lot of children and youth and families from parts of town that people would label the bad part of town or the hood, right? And something I found is that as I've gotten to know people in these communities, most of them are not that different from me. a lot of them, honestly, I wonder if I would be doing as well as they are if I had grown up in some of the situations they've experienced. And this is the point I wanted to make. A lot of times I found that folks living in the ghetto have just as much to offer me as I do them. You know, like a lot of times when we think about ministry, we're like, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to help these people because they need help. And that's not always bad. Like sometimes people need food, sometimes people need encouragement, whatever. But what you'll find is that the very people you're going out to serve end up teaching you, blessing you, and showing you more about yourself and God than you ever realized was possible, you know? Like sometimes I feel like I've learned more from these families that I've worked with than I've taught them. I've kind of wondered who's getting ministered to here, me or them, because I'm learning just as much, if not more, from my interactions with them about life, about struggle, about what's inside of me. And when you begin to see people for who they are and overcome these boundaries and propaganda, and you realize we can all learn and benefit from each other, like that's powerful. And so Jesus asks her for something. Says, give me a drink. And that to me is so striking. It's shocking, honestly, because you'll see, like, she is genuinely shocked. Look at the next verse, or 2 verses down, verse 9. The Samaritan woman said to him, how is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? Because Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Okay, so if you'll humor me, you don't have to do this, but if you'll humor me, close your eyes. I just want you to imagine being this woman for a second, okay? You come up to the well, and you notice there's a Jewish man there. And we don't know exactly how she knew he was a Jew. It might have been the way he dressed or his accent when she heard him talking or whatever. But she knows he's a Jew. And she comes up to him, and you come up to him, and you expect him to ignore you, and you are just as ready to ignore him. You guys have agreed upon unspoken disdain for each other. And so you're just going to act like he's not there. He's going to act like you're not there. That's the way it goes, right? And so you're just like going to get your water and get out of there. But then suddenly he speaks to you. And you look over at him, you know? You're ready for a fight. Like, what the heck? Why is he talking to me? But there's no animosity, condescension, or sarcasm in his voice. He's looking at you with these clear eyes that don't have any agenda. There's no pretense. He's just looking at you like you're a normal human being, and he just asks you for a drink of water. Like, wouldn't that be shocking to you? When you expect someone who's at the very best going to ignore you, at the very worst going to pick a fight with you, he's looking at you with no kind of judgment or condescension in his eyes. He's just, hey, I see you as a person. Could you give me a drink of water? Like, wow, that would be so crazy. You can open your eyes if you want. And she asks him, how? Like, how are you talking to me? Like, there's this unspoken rule of society. We don't do this. Everyone knows that the Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. And the fact that he spoke to her, and not only spoke to her, but made a genuine request from her, was really remarkable. And it got me thinking about this. It was a cool question to consider. In our day and age where there's so much division, or at least people want us to think there's so much division, how can we express compassion and generosity in shocking ways? How can we so overcome the propaganda and divisiveness of our world that it makes people stop and say, how? Like, how could you reach out like that? How could you connect like that? I'm not saying we should, aim to be shocking, of course, but that we should pray for God to help us clear our minds from the noise and help us to see clearly the people that others can't, to love people that others have categorized and belittled, and to show compassion in ways that make the world wonder, how is that possible? That you could just blow past all of these societal things like they don't even exist. Jesus responds to her in an interesting way. In verse 10, he says, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. I want to jump off on a tangent real quick. Like I said, write these things down if they speak to you, because these are just little things that minister to me. I love this verse because in this verse, I see a truth that you never give God more than he wants to give you. Whenever God asks you for something, it's always because in return, he wants to give you something that's so much more than what you sacrificed for him. You know, the devil, when he offers something, it's always because he intends to take more than he gives. And even what he gives becomes bitter. But when God asks for something, it's so that he can give you more. That's why it says, those who lose their life for me will find it. Give, and it will be given to you, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, right? That's the way of God. So, now that's how Jesus responds to her. And I just want to say, I love this woman in this passage. You know, she doesn't, she's ready for a fight. Do you notice that? Like, when he says something to her, she doesn't just oh, why is he talking to me? Like, mumble something and run off. Hold up. How are you talking to me, right? And throughout it, she's going to confront him time after time. She's a smart woman. You can tell. She's not afraid to dialogue. She's not backing down. And she offers Jesus a challenge, if you will, in the previous verse, right? She's like, how are you talking to me? You're a Jew and a man. I'm a woman of Samaria. You know, just that instant, defensiveness. But Jesus doesn't take the bait. I think that's what's so interesting about this response. He doesn't answer her. How is it that he's talking to her? He just says, you know, if you knew who I was, and you're asked, I guess he does answer in a way, but he does it in a way that's not confrontational. He said, I asked you for a drink. If you would have asked me, and I would have given you living water. And I think this is a good thing to consider for our day. Jesus wasn't there to get into an argument with a Samaritan woman, right? And he wasn't there to prove to her that the Jews were right and the Samaritans were wrong, or vice versa. He was there because he wanted to call the Jews and the Samaritans up to a greater truth, that he's the source of living water. You know, there's a place in our society, of course, for dialogue about political differences, religious, denominational ideology differences. You know, there's a place for all of that. But we also need to be aware that our society is constantly calling us to be outraged about something. And not only that, but then to be outraged about it and pick a side and fight for that side against the other side. You know? It's true in many arenas. And it's difficult to separate ourselves from it, because when you pick your side, whatever side that might be, you feel like you're fighting for what's right. You feel like you're fighting for what's good. And the other side is fighting against what's right, and they're fighting against what's good. But yeah, we just have to be wary of that bait that tempts us to pick a side and be outraged against groups of people as a whole without nuance. To be outraged against the immigrants, this shadowy group of people that's taking over our nation. To be outraged against the other political side, this shadowy force that is seeking to destroy America, you know? We got to be careful of that, because there's so much nuance. There's so much individual people. There might be somebody on the other political side who agrees with you 90%, but there's one issue that led them to vote for the other side. They're not part of this shadowy force that's trying to take over America, right? And who decided that there's an imaginary line that separates one piece of ground and makes it their ground, and our piece of ground is on this side, and they can't come over here, you know? Again, I'm not trying to make political statements. I think it's good to protect our nation from threats, but let's be careful that we don't get sucked into this thing where we begin to categorize people and demonize people. Jesus knew the truth. He knew that the Samaritans were flawed. He knew that the Jews were flawed. And he wasn't there to get into an argument that was going to go nowhere. He wanted to take that opportunity to point this woman to the higher truth that she really needed. And that's what we need wisdom for. I think that's kind of what I want to impress is God, help us to have wisdom when we're operating in this world, not to get sucked into outrage culture, but to be able to love people and point them to you and not get sucked into debates and things that are not going to go anywhere ultimately, you know? Ultimately, we don't belong to this nation. We don't belong to any political party. We belong to God. And our job is to be ambassadors of heaven. And where any nation, political party, or church denomination follows the teachings of Jesus, we can affirm that. And when any of them don't, we mourn and call for repentance. We don't make a camp on the left or the right. We call every individual in every camp to follow Jesus. And so Jesus doesn't get bogged down here. He doesn't immediately take the bait and the bait that she'll continue to give him. He offers her something better. You know, he's like, I'm not here to argue about the Samaritans versus the differences. I'm here to point you to something that we all need, the living water. Part of this sermon series is talking about how these passages connect to the Old Testament. And there's this really cool section in the Old Testament where the Jews are wandering around in the wilderness and they are thirsty. They don't have any water, and they're grumbling and complaining. And God tells Moses to go to this rock and to strike it with his staff. And out of the rock comes water that brings life to all the Israelites. And in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul says that rock was Jesus. It was a picture of Jesus. He was the rock that was going to be struck for us, tortured and crucified for us, so that through his death and resurrection would come the living water, the way to eternal life. And so Jesus, I wonder if in his mind, he's kind of has that image in his head. He's like, look, you're drinking this water. I want to give you the living water that God is bringing through me. But she's not convinced. I don't even know if she knows what he's talking about at the moment. So going on to the next verse, she says, Sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock? What's she trying to do here? Trying to get him to argue, right? Like, oh, you think you're better than Jacob? He gave us this, you know. This is his land, and we live here. And again, Jesus doesn't take the bait. He gets back to the main thing. He says to her, everyone who drinks of this water is going to be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will be in him a well of water, becoming him a spring of water, welling up to eternal life. I love this set of verses. Going on another tangent here, because I have these written down in my promise book. Because Jesus is obviously speaking in some spiritual terms here, like whoever drinks of this water is going to be thirsty again, right? Whoever drinks of the water that I give him will never thirst. And I think basically what he's trying to say is there's no glass of water in the world, physical or spiritual, that's going to fill you up. He's the only one who can really satisfy us. We have this running joke in my family that I say I'm hungry at least once a day, because it's true. And it's true, like, y'all know this. You drink a glass of water and eat something and you're satisfied for a little while. But there's nothing in this world that can satisfy our deepest spiritual needs. I was thinking about that, like, no matter how much you achieve, like the cup of success, it's never really going to satisfy you. Like, there's never going to be anything in this life where you get there and you'll be like, I'm good. I don't want anything else. I'm totally satisfied. I don't need any more promotions. I don't need any more money. I don't need any more pleasure. I'm just good. That experience I had, that was it. That was all I needed for the rest of my life. I can die now. Like, that's not going to happen, It all fades. Like, the promotion is cool for a little while, but then it's like, well, am I just stuck here? Is this it? I want something else with my life, And the pleasure, whatever experience the pleasure may be, it's fun it gives you that high for a little bit, but then you want it again. You want something else. And that's because our deepest spiritual needs can't be met through anything in this world. You can buy weapons and security systems, but you can't buy peace. in the soul. You know? Like all these end time preppers who... But you can't buy peace, you know? You can chase pleasure and experience, but you can't find anything that's going to fill that aching need for love and acceptance and contentment. What a powerful thing to be content. To say, in my life, I'm content where I'm at. For Paul to be able to say in prison, I have learned to be content in all things. That's supernatural stuff. You can buy a bunch of stuff, but it doesn't deal with that aching weight of loneliness that we all feel. We are a spiritual being in a physical body, and only God can satisfy our deepest needs. So I just think that's cool. You know, one thing Hudson Taylor pointed out is that this drinking from Jesus, it's not a one and done thing. That the way it's written here, Jesus said, whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty. And it's kind of this idea that those who continually come to me and drink will never be thirsty. It's not like I pray one time to Jesus and I'm good. It's like when you have this relationship with him, where you're looking to him to fill your deepest needs, he'll satisfy you. And I guess this stands out to me because I struggle with discontentment, you know? I really do. And so many times I go to God and say, Lord, I'm feeling discontent. I don't know where this is coming from, but I need you to fill me up in here, whatever's going on. And this verse gives me a lot of encouragement. So we're going to blaze through this here because it's getting late. But the woman said to him in verse 15, Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water. And we don't know, we can't, it's like text. You can't tell people's tone, but we don't know if she's being sarcastic or if there's any seriousness in this here. But Jesus does a pretty cool response, I think. He says, Go, call your husband and come here. The woman answered him, I have no husband. So Jesus said to her, You are right in saying, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you said is true. And Jesus is showing her 2 things. He knows her deepest secrets, which would have been mind-blowing to her, right? Like imagine somebody you've never met, especially someone on the other side of the fence who's a Jew, speaking into your life, your deepest secrets. It's like, whoa. And the next thing she says is like, okay, I perceive you're a prophet. Something's going on here. But another thing that stood out to me about this is I was like, why would Jesus bring this up? That almost seems confrontational. Why is he going right to the heart of the thing, Yeah, you've had 5 husbands. But to me, and I encourage you to think about it yourself. It's almost like what Jesus is revealing to her is that in order to get this living water, because that's what she asked for. She said, Sir, give me this water. In order to really experience God's fullness in your life and the living water, we have to be willing to let him into all the areas of our life, even the deepest, darkest places that we want to keep secret. She's like, Sir, give me this water. He's like, okay, if you want the water in your life, let's talk about this. Let's get real about where you're really at and what's really going on in your life. Sometimes, I don't know exactly how we do it, but there are things we sort of want to not deal with God and definitely don't want to tell anyone else. And I think in order to really experience that fullness of God's life, we got to be willing to let him in. And so Jesus hones in on that. It's like, okay, let's get real. This is where you're at in life. If you want the living water, we're going to have to be honest about this. And so she's definitely caught off guard now. Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. But she's not totally ready to lay down her confrontationalism. But I feel like she's softening up a little bit. She says, Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, Mount Gerizim, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. And again, he doesn't take the bait. That's just so astounding to me. Jesus is not here to get into an argument. He wants to point her to something that's really going to matter. And Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. Look, you guys, people are arguing about, is it going to be there in Jerusalem or is it going to be here on Mount Gerizim? Let me tell you something. This debate, ultimately, it's not going to matter because the time is coming when we're not going to worship in either of those places. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and it's now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So again, she tries to pull him into that debate. He doesn't buy it, and he does something amazing. You remember I told you earlier, the Jews were looking for the Messiah, the one who would restore Israel spiritually and politically. The Samaritans are looking for the Tahib, the one who will restore them spiritually and restore true worship to Mount Gerizim, right? The Jews were mistaken about the political part. The Samaritans are mistaken about the Mount Gerizim part, you know? And Jesus masterfully here reveals to her that he is the one the Jews are looking for and the Samaritans. And that even though they both have some of it wrong, he's here to restore both of them spiritually to the Father, to call them both to worship the Father in spirit and in truth. He said, look, the day is soon coming. True worship isn't going to be here on this mountain. It's not going to be in Jerusalem. God wants to transform people in the heart so they can worship him in spirit and in truth. And so managing amazingly to dodge all of the bait towards fruitless argument. Jesus not only sees this woman, he not only affirms her humanity, but he points her to truth that transcends culture and politics and national identities. And so imagine what would have happened if Jesus had done it different. Imagine if in the beginning, gotten off track and started arguing about, well, you know, Jerusalem really is a place where we should worship right now, you know? Or, why you got to be so confrontational, you know? Or something like that. He doesn't buy into her bait at all. He sees her, he sees her value, and he's like, I just want to point her to Jesus. Or, well, point him to himself, I guess. And look at what she says. And I don't know if they translated it this way because John was writing it. But the woman said to him, I know that the Messiah, or maybe she said this because he thought he would understand better what she was talking about. I know that the Messiah, instead of the Tahib, she says Messiah. I know the Messiah is coming, the one who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. And Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. And man, it is so cool. Like this conversation could have gone sideways in so many ways. But not only does Jesus manage to minister to her and open her heart to the gospel, she goes and tells the village. And then you got a whole village of Samaritans coming out to listen to a Jewish dude talk about spiritual things. Like what? That does not happen, you know? And it was all because Jesus did not allow the political, cultural divides to keep him from seeing this woman and loving her. And I think we can definitely learn something from that. There's no way to address every situation you're going to run into. But if we can, in our day, seek to see the humanity and value even in those with whom we strongly disagree, if we can avoid getting bogged down in pointless debates and try instead to point people to Jesus, I think we could make a real difference in our area and in our world. One last story, and I'll wrap it up. Zane, you can come on up if you want. I don't even know how this happened, but I was on Facebook last night, and I don't know if they just give you random. I was in my search menu, and somehow on there was like this Montgomery County criminal mugshot page, and like I don't even know how that got there, but I was like, what is this? So I click on it, and somehow whenever someone gets booked into some jail in Montgomery County, their mugshot gets uploaded to this page, right? And it was just so interesting because all it is their face, and then you can see a little bit about why they got arrested. And I'm just scrolling down looking at all these people, some of them are high, none of them look pretty or happy to be there, like some of them are angry. And I'm thinking about this passage, and I'm looking at some of the comments, and like people are like, yeah, they deserve to be there, and lock those druggies up and keep them there, stuff like that, And I'm just thinking about, look at all these people, these beautiful people that God loves. Like, how can we see people, even when we disagree with them, even when they've done things that aren't good? How can we see them and love them the way Jesus does? How can we show compassion in a way that would make them be like, how? Why? How could you act like this towards me? That is a powerful challenge for me, and I hope for you as well. It's definitely something I want to think and pray about